When empires retreat, they rarely announce it as a retreat. They call it efficiency, sovereignty, cost-cutting. But the world feels the difference immediately. In early January 2026, Washington didn't fire a shot or break an alliance. It signed a document. 66 international organizations and treaties, climate, health, development, labor, human rights, gone in one coordinated move. To many Americans, this looked distant, abstract, bureaucratic. To Asia, it felt like a sudden pressure drop in the global system. I want you to pause here for a moment, because when the principal architect of the post-war order begins dismantling its own scaffolding, the consequences don't stay contained. They travel, quietly, unevenly, relentlessly. If you care about how power really works, not in headlines, but in systems, this is where the story begins. Stay with me. This isn't yet about China, or ASEAN, or Australia. First, we need to understand what exactly has shifted and why this moment is different from all the times before. At its core, this is not a story about withdrawal. It's a story about what replaces presence when it disappears. For decades, Southeast Asia has lived inside a system designed to soften imbalance, not to erase power differences, but to manage them. Rules, forums, norms, institutions that made size less decisive and predictability more valuable than force. ASEAN's centrality, fragile as it is, rests on a simple assumption that major powers show up, fund the system, and accept constraints in exchange for influence. When that assumption holds, smaller states hedge. They don't choose sides, they buy time. The January 2026 decision strikes directly at that foundation. Not because institutions are perfect, they aren't, but because they are load-bearing. Climate coordination, health surveillance, development finance, human rights norms. These are not moral luxuries, they are shock absorbers. Remove too many at once, and pressure doesn't vanish. It redistributes toward bilateral deals, toward leverage, toward the biggest actors in the room. To understand why this moment matters so deeply, we have to step back and trace how this system was built in the first place. After 1945, American power followed an unusual logic. It did not rule by distance alone. It embedded itself. Washington helped build institutions that constrained others and itself. The United Nations, Bretton Woods, the global trade regime. This was not altruism. It was strategy. By giving smaller states voice and predictability, U.S. leadership felt legitimate rather than imposed. That architecture mattered enormously in Asia. It allowed countries with vastly different sizes, systems, and histories to coexist without constant crisis. Rules reduced miscalculation. Institutions stretched time. They turned raw power into managed influence. Even when the United States acted unilaterally in the past, the exits were narrow, selective, reversible. A treaty here, an organization there. The system bent, but it held. What makes January 2026 different is scale and intent. The review touched almost everything: climate governance, global health, development, and labor frameworks. Not one pillar, but many at once. This isn't a pause. It's an unpicking. And when scaffolding comes down across an entire structure, stress appears where you least expect it. The first cracks, in Southeast Asia, are already visible. The first shock doesn't come from missiles or markets. It comes from the atmosphere. Literally. Climate governance is where this retreat becomes immediately tangible. The United States was not a peripheral player here. It was central to the UN climate framework, to the Paris Agreement's momentum, to the funding streams that turned promises into action. With its withdrawal, a vacuum opens, not just of money, but of signal. Roughly 18% of the World Health Organization's budget, over a quarter of assessed climate-related contributions across UN bodies, gone. That absence does something subtle but dangerous. It slows everyone else down. Large emitters gain political cover. Transitions stretch. Timelines slip. For Southeast Asia, this is not theoretical. Rising seas, extreme heat, food insecurity, Vietnam, Indonesia, the Philippines facing projected GDP losses of several percentage points annually by mid-century from climate impacts alone. Multilateral climate finance existed to stop those stresses from becoming destabilizing. Without it, the burden doesn't disappear. It concentrates on those least equipped to carry it. If this analysis matters to you, now is the moment to engage. Because climate is only the first pressure point. The next shock travels faster and through human bodies. To understand why these shocks compound, you have to look beneath the surface at the machinery itself. Multilateral institutions are often described as talk shops. Slow, inefficient, frustrating, but that misses their real function. They coordinate risk. They pool uncertainty. They prevent every crisis from becoming a test of raw power. When the United States withdraws, the immediate loss is funding. But the deeper loss is coordination authority. Standards fragment. Data sharing thins. Trust erodes. Take health governance. The World Health Organization was never designed to command states. It was designed to synchronize them. Surveillance, early warning, vaccine coordination, shared baselines of truth. Remove the largest donor, and the system doesn't collapse overnight. It frays. Other contributors hesitate. Budgets tighten. Mandates narrow. Chatham House has already warned that U.S. disengagement spooks secondary donors. Not out of hostility, but uncertainty. No one wants to overinvest in a system whose anchor may not return. This is the hidden mechanism at work. Retreat doesn't create chaos immediately. It creates lag, delay, drift. And drift, in tightly coupled systems, is how crises accelerate quietly, then all at once. The consequences of that drift become visible very quickly in Southeast Asia. The second crisis arrives without warning and without borders. Health security is unfinished business in Asia. COVID was not a one-off trauma. It was a rehearsal, a test of coordination under stress. In January 2026, the United States formally exits the World Health Organization. Its largest single donor, at the moment global preparedness remains incomplete. During COVID, Southeast Asia depended on WHO coordination, surveillance networks, shared data, vaccine distribution frameworks. None of this was perfect, but it was synchronized. Fragment that system, and outbreaks move faster than institutions can respond. Information slows, trust gaps widen, responses diverge. Chatham House has already noted a compounding effect. As Washington steps back, other donors trim contributions. Not in protest, but caution. This is how systemic risk multiplies. Not through dramatic failure, but cumulative hesitation. For Southeast Asia, densely populated and deeply interconnected, the cost of delay is exponential. A localized outbreak becomes regional before coordination catches up. This is the second pressure spike, not louder than the first, but sharper. And together, climate stress and health insecurity begin to overlap. At that point, this is no longer a technical problem. It becomes strategic. Because when institutions weaken, power fills the space. This is where the story becomes personal. Because systems don't fail in the abstract. They fail on people. If you live in Southeast Asia, this shift lands directly on your life. Not as ideology, but as heat, food prices, health risks, and uncertainty. When climate finance slows, adaptation projects stall, flood defenses wait, crop resilience weakens. When health coordination thins, outbreaks last longer, spread wider, cost more. You feel it first as inconvenience, then as anxiety, then as loss. And here is the cruel irony. You did not design this system, nor decide to abandon it. Yet you absorb the shock. Multilateral institutions were meant to translate distant power into local stability. When they weaken, that translation fails. Risk stops being shared. It becomes personal. This is the emotional core of the withdrawal. Not anti-Americanism, not geopolitics, but exposure. If this analysis resonates, don't treat it as background noise, because understanding power is the first step toward resisting its excesses. And resistance, in this case, doesn't mean confrontation. It means coordination among those who remain. That coordination will now have to extend beyond the region, because the shockwaves don't stop at ASEAN's borders. What happens next is a quiet realignment, not declared, but felt. As multilateral forums thin, gravity shifts towards size and leverage. Bilateral deals become heavier. Influence becomes more transactional. This is the terrain where the largest players move most easily. China recognizes this moment clearly, not as a crisis, but as an opening. Beijing already funds roughly 15% of the UN's regular budget. It is the largest contributor to UN peacekeeping among the Permanent Security Council members. And beyond the UN system, alternatives are ready. The Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, Belt and Road financing, parallel development channels. None of this guarantees benevolent leadership, but absence creates opportunity, and structure follows money. For Southeast Asia, this does not mean alignment by choice. It means adaptation under pressure. When institutional buffers weaken, strategic bargaining sharpens. Australia feels this shift acutely. Its prosperity has depended on rules that allow middle powers to matter. Assuming automatic U.S. leadership now looks less like prudence and more like nostalgia. The global system doesn't collapse when a hegemon steps back. It rebalances. Unevenly. And that rebalancing sets the stage for the hardest question of all. What comes next? And who carries the system forward? The future now unfolds along three possible paths, not predictions, but pressures. The first is adaptation. Institutions survive because others step in. ASEAN deepens coordination on climate resilience. Regional health mechanisms strengthen. Partnerships with Japan, the EU, and Australia thicken the institutional fabric left behind. Multilateralism becomes leaner, more regional, but functional. The second path is drift. No collapse, no replacement. Frameworks persist, but underfunded and cautious. Coordination slows. Crisis response becomes uneven. Southeast Asia muddles through absorbing shocks, buying time, hoping for a U.S. return. The third path is erosion. Institutions hollow out. Rules give way to leverage. Climate adaptation becomes conditional. Health cooperation fragmented. Strategic choices narrow not because leaders want them to, but because systems no longer cushion risk. History suggests hegemons often come back. After crises remind them that sovereignty cannot manage carbon, viruses, or instability alone. Until then, this is an interregnum, a period of strategic thinning, fewer guardrails, more improvisation, higher stakes. And how Southeast Asia navigates this gap will shape its future more than any single great power decision. Absence is never neutral. It rearranges responsibility. The United States may yet return to the institutions it has stepped away from. History suggests it often does pulled back by crises that refuse to be managed alone. But until that moment, the burden shifts to those who remain. For Southeast Asia, this is a test of institutional confidence, not power, but persistence. The willingness to fund, to convene, to believe in cooperation even when it feels slow and unglamorous. For Australia, it is a moment of choice, not to replace a hegemon, but to act as a stabilizer, an investor, a convener, a defender of rules when they are least fashionable. And for you, watching this unfold, the insight is simple but unsettling. Global order is not sustained by declarations. It is sustained by presence. When major powers walk away, systems do not vanish. They strain, and the costs travel outward to those far from the decision-makers. If this analysis sharpened how you see power, stay engaged. Share it. Question it. Carry it forward. Because the future of this region will be shaped not only by who dominates, but by who stays, who funds, and who refuses to let cooperation quietly die. This is not the end of the story. It is the thinning of the guardrails. And what happens next is being decided now.